All right, we are ready to start. May I first introduce our panelists? Jorma Ollila is so well known in Finland that he's not at all needed to be introduced, but he is chairman of Nokia Group and the Royal Dutch Shell. John Kornblum, long-term diplomat. He was awarded 1996 with the highest award of the U.S. For the U.S. diplomats. He is now president of Lazard in Germany. And then John Kao, his background is Chinese, but he has been living in the United States. He is an author and advisor, strategic advisor, written rather popular books about innovation. One of them is Innovation Nation, which is recently published, so he is expert on innovation. And then Pat Cox, who is a former member of the European Parliament. He was member of Parliament from 1989 to 2004, and last 2 years, from 2002 to 2004, he served as president of the European Parliament. And now he's president of the European movement. Correct. And now I will give you a couple of minutes, 4, maximum 5 minutes, to give your introductory remarks. How the world looks from your perspectives, and what is the future of our globe having an impact, what Sitran is doing here in Finland. Jorma, would you agree that we will start with Pat, who is former Speaker of Parliament, so that...
It's a fine order.
All right, you will start. Pat, please.
Okay, well thank you very much indeed for the invitation. To you and through you, Madam President, congratulations on the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Finnish Republic. Through you, Chairman Esko Aho, congratulations on the 40th anniversary of Sitran.
By the way, I'm President.
President, Mr. President, excuse me, I should get it right.
To be correct.
I wouldn't like to diminish you, but also congratulations to you on the thought leadership which you've been giving in Europe in particular on the question of innovation. I was asked to talk a little bit about globalisation, so a quick roadmap for a quick telegram rather than a long speech. Firstly, a little bit on context, then a picture about today, a quick picture about tomorrow, some downsides and some challenges. I suppose the point of departure for me is a context. An awful lot has gone into building globalisation. In part it was post-war institutions, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. It was added to regionally by things like European Union, the Single European Act and the Single Market, by NAFTA, the Free Trade Agreement in North America, and so there's a strong rules element in all of this, the GATT Agreement and the WTO. And rules require consensus, and your earlier discussion on maintaining consensus shows the importance of the rules-based part. We've had the extraordinary growth in recent decades of transnational corporations whose scale and ambition has become truly global. We've had the ICT revolution in the 1980s, the flattening earth of Friedman's analysis. We've had an extraordinary growth in the freer flow of capital, which has had an enormous impact in financial terms. We've had an enormous growth in transport logistics and new players. The collapse of the Soviet Union and China opening up under Deng Xiaoping doubled at a stroke the global labour force, to take but one statistic. The current state, painting a little bit by numbers. I'm no artist, don't get too bothered with the numbers, but think of the picture that the numbers are painting. Growing global interdependence, and I would mark out especially that between EU and USA. Foreign direct investment last year, $1.3 billion US. The larger share of that was between advanced countries, and the lesser share, but a very important one, to developing countries. Last year, at $379 billion of FDI, foreign direct investment, it was the largest ever flow into developing countries. In terms of inflows, hosting investment, This goes up and down. China has been number one in recent years, but last year the USA was tops, the United Kingdom second, and France third. In developing country terms, China and Chinese Hong Kong were respectively numbers 1 and 2. In general, the greatest FDI flows, foreign direct investment flows, has been EU to US and vice versa. They have accelerated since 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and they've continued to accelerate in the current decade, notwithstanding the various hiccups in EU-US transatlantic political relations on Iraq and so on. Since 1990, employment in terms of the affiliates of these companies abroad has grown by a factor of 3. The largest number is found with 24 million Chinese working for foreign affiliates. The Fortune Global 500 had a very scarce presence of non-advanced country firms as recently as 10 years ago. Now you will find 24 Chinese in the top 500, 6 Indians, and as you probably know, 3 Finnish companies. Services account for 2/3 of the investment, and manufacturing share in that investment has been declining. The opportunity and what we've got from it, 78,000 transnational corporations, 780,000 affiliates, 10% of global GDP accounted for by those, and 1/3 of world exports. Huge opportunity and huge capacity. The future, I suppose I focus for reasons I don't need to explain on China and India. By 2030, it's expected that world output will double to $75 trillion US. The developing countries' share of that will go up from 23 to 33%. So they will have 1/3 of a much larger world output. China and India probably will account for 18% or more of all of that output by 2030. China is expected to narrow its income gap from 19% of the advanced country average today to 48%. In population terms, the world is likely to grow by 1.5 billion by 2030. The largest single national growth, India, by 320 million, all of Africa 320 million, and even with one-child policy, China 170 million. Biggest issue for opportunity, growth in middle classes. Today, middle class is 7.6% of the global economy, 2030, 16.1%. Largest growth in middle class expected to be China, 44% of the world's middle class in 20 years' time. Total extra numbers in middle class, 740 million, making more than 1 billion in that class by 2030. Half of those will be Chinese, enormous market opportunity. Quickly on downsides, global public goods and spillovers inadequately addressed. Citizens were mentioned earlier, and governance issues and distance and complexity. It's all there to contemplate. Fears of races to the bottom about our standards. Further environmental degradation. For example, in China in year 2000, they produced 300 gigawatts of electricity. Last year, 600. By 2010, it's estimated 1,200. But the interesting thing about that volume is most of it comes from coal. And one of our big issues, of course, is about climate change. You know, financial instability, the subprime market is a current example, one of those issues which needs to be factored in. Income distribution, a very quick word on that. The Human Development Index produced by UNDP is a good measure of some of the inequalities. It looks at life longevity, it looks at education and purchasing power. One statistic, Norway, 40 times wealthier than Niger, which is one of the poorest. Norwegians live twice as long as those from Niger, and in terms of education, universal access to all levels of education in Norway, 21% access to primary education in Niger. The lowest countries, according to the Human Development Index from the United Nations, have actually got worse since the 1990s, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and mostly explained by the AIDS pandemic. All in all, other issues that arise, and I want to start winding up. There clearly is in the global economy a premium pay for skill. There clearly is in the global economy a risk of relocation, of deindustrialisation, and tough times for the unskilled, winners and losers. And I think that's really the issue. The challenge is combating inequality, combating climate change, and simultaneously, I think, how to allow developing economies to develop with all those challenges being faced and to meet the expectations of the sort we just heard in the earlier panel discussion. The biggest challenge I think that we face collectively and that Sitran can give some leadership on in Finland and more widely is how do we manage to avoid preventing a future that could be so positive for so many on a win-win basis.
Thank you. We have now started to paint the picture, and now next speaker is Jorma Ollila. Probably will have some more details about technological aspects.
Yeah, what an agenda, Mr. Chairman. It's a broad one. But if you look at the current perception that we have on globalization, it is that it has raised hundreds of millions of people from absolute poverty, provided conditions for decent life and learning for millions, and contributed significantly to price stability in the developed world. On the other hand, there are legitimate concerns which have been expressed about inequality increasing in many parts of the world and offshoring of jobs, which lead into difficult transitions. I personally believe that globalization is as good as we will make it. Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, in my view, is one of the leading thinkers on globalization. He doesn't accept the typical normal truth, so every book is worth reading. One of his quotes is reasonably recent, that the story of globalization today must be written in two inks, one colored by technical change and the other by state action. That's very interesting, because there's no mention of trade liberalization or WTO. And he's a trade economist. That's when I read in university, his first articles, it was about theory of international trade. Actually, his point is that it is not so much about trade liberalization, but about technological change and the appropriate good government action, which makes a good end result of globalization. And that those two things have actually been the key drivers in making globalization happen through the growth that it has created and thereby the prosperity that we have seen. When we look at the knowledge-based economy, the key thing obviously here globally now is that the knowledge does flow freely across boundaries, may they be geographical, political or organizational. And in this sense, truly the world is flat. Information and communication technologies have provided tools for rich and poor to facilitate and manage the knowledge flows and to increase the wealth through the productivity improvements that have happened. Obviously, the mobile communication is the case in point, with, as we heard last week, 3.3 billion users now, which is 50% of the population. Of course, there's a bit of a misnomer there, because some people have two SIM cards, but that's beside the point.
Is it a good thing?
I think it is, because, again, more competition, and that will benefit everybody. But we are very close to being half of the population there. And what has actually happened is that it has increased the real opportunity for universal access and providing equality for all to participate. So technology is a great equalizer, in addition to being a great growth generator, if there is the appropriate government action, because that in many cases, particularly when we look at the emerging economies, is needed. And India is a case in point here about technology, a combination of technology and the appropriate good government action. In late 90s, India was considered to really be behind China in terms of taking many of the initiatives in their technology policy, and also in terms of their liberalization of their markets, both internally as well as to the external world. And some of the fundamental regulatory reforms had not been taken. So I personally made about 7 or 8 trips into India in the latter half of the 1990s. Yes, I did some marketing, but I mean, it wasn't really worth it with 50,000 phones sold every month. But the real thing was twice a year to meet all the ministers, starting low with every civil servant in the appropriate ministries, ending up with a prime minister, telling them that they need to do something about the 48% import tariffs on everything relating to new technologies in telecommunications.
Is it a secret how much you are selling now?
And I'll come to that. The protectionistic attitude was really strongly prevailing, and suddenly to all of us, just about when we were losing our hope and cancelling our tickets for the next trip, in 2000 India dropped the 48% import tariffs to 7%, and that's where it sits today. And that's when the curve starts. If you look at the curve of telecommunication penetration or whatever telecom statistics in India, started to go up exponentially, and you now have 20%, more than 20% of the Indians with a phone connection when they had a couple of percent having a fixed line connection in the early 90s. And the interesting thing is that the government also did something which was very important. They made sure that there is true competition, and that some of those cartel developments, which we still see actually in the very many developed economies, did not take hold. So when in 99 a mobile phone call costed 32 cents per minute, it now costs 1 cent per minute to talk. And they do talk long, I can tell you, these days. And it was very difficult even for the industry as such to understand that this will be positive and that the volumes would compensate for the price to come down. So there was really good government action coupled with the technology which was introduced, and things took off. When we're looking at the development now in China and India, yes, it's very interesting to see the good developments, and we need to continue to work hard on the digital divide, which many parties are doing. But we also can see that, we can't be sure that the scientific and technological leadership that Western Europe and US does have will continue to stay put. In fact, China and India have realized that they have a real opportunity to join in through their own R&D investments, through their investments into universities, through their investments starting from primary education, which is really improving and building a base going forward in such a way that we will see in the years to come China and India challenging the global position that the technological community in the developed economies is enjoying. So the underlying factors of competitiveness and technological superiority is very much under pressure, and that's one of the great things that is happening through globalization. Not only giving them an opportunity to prosper through the technology that is provided to them, but that they can now participate in the same game, which is being very beneficial to the Western societies. At the same time, we need to make sure that we step up our act, particularly in Europe, that Finland obviously is part of, and which Mr. President addressed in his comments on the competitive challenges of Finland that Sitran is addressing. When you look at the countries that have done well during the last 10-20 years, it's actually quite remarkable to see that size here has an inverse correlation. Because if you look at the two best performing countries in Western world, it's Ireland and Finland, really because they have learned and accepted the art of adjusting to what is the challenge of the day. The agility that they have demonstrated has given them, through the global rules of the game, which actually are the same for everybody, has given them a real chance. And I think this speaks really well about our mentality as it should be. It should be an optimistic mentality, making sure that we are doing the right things. When I look at personally my lessons as a business leader on, what does it take? It takes the right kind of education, but it takes really the right kind of human endeavor and creativity. The mindset, the drive that only human beings can create by working together. So the human capacity to create new ideas is really unlimited if you lead the people in the right way. And I think this is where the small country like Finland can take a little bit of pride that we have done something well. Yes, through a lot of problem, through a lot of disturbances and pain, but probably there aren't any situations in the world history anyway where a real gain would come unless you have some pain along the way. Perhaps with this I will close, really underlining the right kind of balance, combination of technological change and good government in what it can bring in terms of the benefits of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorma. We still have one secrecy remaining, how many phones you are selling there in India, but probably you have an opportunity to say it later on.
It's a good 50% on the 6 million per month. So.
all right. That gives us certain figures, yeah. John Kornblum, you are expert both in the United States or US affairs and European affairs. You are living nowadays in Europe. You have a special kind of perspective to our challenges. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Well, it's also for me a great pleasure to be here. I have actually lived in Finland in the past, as Esko knows, and it's always a great pleasure to be back. And I think what's very interesting about this panel is that the issues raised by the first panel have flowed directly into it. On the one hand, a current feeling of success, but on the other hand, a certain unease that maybe this success won't last forever. And I think it's not just Finland who feels that way. I think it's more or less at least the entire Western world. What I'd like to try to do, since there have been already so many details and very interesting ideas of what is going on in the, shall we call it, the concrete world, I would like to talk a little bit about the psychological world of our countries. Because I think, and this is a very basic principle in life, if you're going to get somewhere, you have to know where you're starting from and you have to know what questions to ask. And I think if we're going to meet all these challenges, which I agree with what everyone has said completely, we have to remember what we have in our heads when we think about this. Mr. Cox talked about the rules-based structures that we're living in. And we have all been brought up, I certainly, to believe that the rule of law, the rule of structures, the rule of equality are the ways that you achieve success, be it in your personal life, in your business, or in your nation. I think that's all true, and it will stay true. On the other hand, I think it's important to note, and that we recall very much in this period of upheaval, that the kind of rules that we're living with right now, and the kinds of structures that we're living with, come out of war and depression. Every one of us has lived through ourselves, our parents lived through it, our grandparents lived through an era which began in the late 19th century, which was characterized by the breakdown of an old structure. The 19th century, if you will, aristocratic empire structure. Finland itself, 100 years ago, was part of an empire. Most of Eastern Europe was part of an empire. Much of Asia was part of a French or a British empire. There was even a little German empire out there for a while. This broke down rapidly and, as we know, terribly dramatically and catastrophically between 1900 and 1945. In 1900, we were in a phase of globalization which had reached the peak of human civilization, both scientifically, both institution-wise. Europe had more or less open borders. Europe had a common currency, which was called gold. European students went around and studied at various universities. In the early 1900s, there were more PhDs earned by Americans in German universities than there were in the United States. I could go on and on. We had reached a peak which is perhaps somewhat similar to the one we've reached right now. That all collapsed for lots of reasons which we need not go into right now. But it means that all of us are now have in our heads the idea as rules being absolutely necessary not to confront the future, but in fact to stave off the past. And for all of my admiration of the European Union, I think it's safe to say that much of the dynamic in the European Union is still not to fight World War II all over again. In fact, it was set up not to fight World War II all over again. And I was myself, I started thinking about this, it might be interesting to hear, when the leaders of the European Union started to sell the euro, which is a very innovative, very revolutionary kind of idea. What was the argument that the main leaders of the European Union used? And I'm thinking of Mr. Kohl and Mr. Mitterrand in this case. We need this so we'll never have another war in Europe. This was the official politics of France and Germany in selling the euro to their populations. Populations, by the way, who didn't want the euro at all, and still don't, by the way. It would lose today if it were put to a vote in Germany. In other words, we are now sticking to structures, we are sticking to modes of behavior which are legitimate. They've also been unbelievably successful, not because we believe they're going to get us into the future, but because they were set up to deal with a very dramatic and catastrophic past. These structures are now going to start breaking down. They were made more firm by the Cold War. The Cold War is over. They were made more firm by colonialism. Colonialism ended a long time ago, although the mentality of colonialism is still there. And of course we have the shock and the confusion, the dismay over 9/11, the World Trade Center, and the fear of something which is called Islamic terrorism. Notice I haven't mentioned technology, I haven't mentioned population, I haven't mentioned any of the things which we usually talk about and which we should talk about. But I think it's important also to understand this really difficult psychological structure that we're dealing with. In the case of Europe, there probably will be a historian here who can prove me wrong, but as far as I know, this current age right now, the beginning of the 21st century, is the first time that Europe has ever had to change peacefully. You've had it done for you before through wars. Every 20 or 30 years there was a war which led to great upheaval, great change, new structures, etc. Or maybe there was a nice depression thrown in every once in a while just to make sure that people got the idea. Now this isn't going to happen, luckily. There's not going to be a war. There's not going to be a depression. Challenges that we have, such as failed states or terrorism, are real and horrible challenges, but they're not going to change the structures of our countries in any way. Instead, we're going to have to find a new way of thinking about these challenges. We're going to have to think about the new players who are coming into the international system. 100 years ago, the most destabilizing new players in the world, who were they? Germany and the United States. They were upsetting the European concert of nations of the 19th century. A third one was coming up fast, and that was Russia. Now there are new players who are emerging from a very unfortunate colonialist kind of past. China, India, nations of Southeast Asia, others. They're going to simply not accept a world system based on Western values. Not that they're against Western values, but our Bretton Woods system, our post-1945 system, has essentially been a Western, an Atlantic club, with the Atlantic being not an ocean separating people, but a lake connecting two parts of the same structures. And every major international structure, one of the ones that I think is most important to look at is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a United Nations structure, which is every United Nations member is bound to, but it's a Western structure, has our principles in it. So we're going to have to deal with coming to terms with a world in which our ways of behavior simply will not necessarily find universal acceptance anymore, at the same time that all of these things are happening inside our economies. I was asked to say a few words about the environment. I'll say only, I think, actually, Mr. Aho's description of it as a thing that will hopefully stimulate unbelievable technological investment and change, as Sputnik did 50 years ago. But also, trying to take my slightly turned around logic here, let's ask a few other questions. How are we, in the face of all of these problems that we believe we see with climate change, how are we going to generate the resources to deal with all of the internal problems we have, all of the international problems, and climate change at a time when our solutions to climate change essentially are, what should we say, undermining all the sources of energy that we know right now? Atomic power, coal, oil and gas. The other ones we're experimenting with are not going to come anywhere near, and the various statistics you read talk about 1, 2, 3, 5% of replacement value for these structures. But if you go to the country that I live in, Germany, they now are talking about defining their energy policy by climate change needs. If they do that, of course, they won't have any energy to have a policy about. How can the political structures, I think this is a very important one, we're talking about how business is approaching this. Business and politicians are at the moment not really talking to each other. They're talking to each other, but they're talking by each other. How can corporations, global corporations, fit themselves into global political structures, while at the same time they're chartered in this or that country, and the politicians who they deal with have to get reelected, and that means maintaining jobs, period. It doesn't mean all these other fancy things that we talk about. A politician who needs to get reelected thinks of one thing, and that is to get jobs for his constituents. The Kyoto Treaty, which I am not a believer in, I'll say this very openly right now, was a rules-based structure trying to impose rules on countries such as China and India and also the United States, which they had no intention of keeping and could never keep. Once the Kyoto Treaty was signed, the United States Senate voted on it, and it voted against it 98-0.
To 2, somebody said.
Well, to 2 because there were 2 absent. I was just going to say that. Had they been there, it would have been 100-0.
Yeah.
Okay, it was 98-2 because they didn't vote. This is not to attack the process that went into Kyoto, but to argue that unless we get to something which is a more globally integrated approach to these things, which is based on science and technology, which is based on a more matrix kind of approach, I'm afraid that we're going to be, on the one hand, talking about the environment, whereas the practical economy is simply going to keep doing what it's been doing all along. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Another John now, John Kao, and you have your 5 minutes to comment. Probably you will take the role of innovations in this future perspective.
So, Madam President, Mr. Aho, thank you very much for this opportunity to share in what seems to be a double birthday celebration, both for the Republic of Finland and for Sitran. So these are always happy occasions. I want to spend my 5 minutes talking with you about innovation, which I think, as we sit here at the dawn of the 21st century, is more important an issue than ever before. One barometer is simple quantitative attention to this topic. I last year gave a speech, for instance, at Google. I decided to Google the word innovation so as to eat their cooking and see what would happen, and I came up with 320 million hits for the term, which is part of our problem too. We know a lot about innovation, but in a sense, so much information implies that maybe we know less than we should. So I, for the past decade or so, have been on a worldwide quest to look for the sources of innovation and to look at countries, innovation nations, as I call them, who've established something in the nature of best practices for innovation. So, for example, we have countries like Finland, which I think, in my view, have established a world-class ecosystem for innovation, which has also wisely said that the question, what's next, should always be top of mind, that this is not a mature discipline, but actually a discipline in evolution, and that one has to keep going in order to constantly develop new kinds of best practices. Or we look at a country like Singapore, not that different from Finland in terms of size, slightly different climate, adopting what I would call a kind of focused factory approach to innovation. You know, 3 core priorities in Singapore for innovation, one of which, life sciences, has the goal of placing 10,000 PhD scientists into what they call the Singapore Biopolis within the next 15 years. As a benchmark, 10,000 PhD scientists is more scientists than exist at the National Institutes of Health in Washington. So it's an example of how a small country can compete way above its weight class when it comes to innovation. Or then if you look north from Singapore to China, you may have noted that the 11th fifth-year plan of the Politburo in China said that innovation was to be a national priority and that they were going to pursue something called indigenous innovation, which I interpret really as applying sort of industrial metrics to the output of academics by evaluating them based on the numbers of patents they produce and the numbers of papers they write, which is, in my view, far from an excellent metric, but at least is a metric that offers the possibility of measurement. But the astonishing thing about China, too, is the explosion of entrepreneurial creativity. We were speaking at lunch about the Chinese car industry. My anecdotal impression is that there are over 100 new car companies in China with a business model from everything from hydrogen cells to, you know, extremely low-cost car to various versions of hybrid technology. So China is employing what you might call a brute force strategy, in the belief that if you have a lot of quantity, i.e. a lot of PhDs or a lot of new companies, eventually you'll get to quality. Eventually you'll get to something world-changing. And I think the situation in China, just as it is in other parts of the world, is very fluid, very dynamic. One should not take a snapshot of China and say, oh, you know, sort of lower in the value chain, less accomplished PhDs, because this is all changing very rapidly, as it is in many countries, as innovation becomes an organizing principle for countries, and as many countries now are beginning to race to the innovation high ground. Which leads to the question of what's going on in the United States. I like to call this moment for America kind of a silent Sputnik moment, because the irony is that today I think America does have a tremendous innovation challenge, even though it's not suffering the kind of pain or trauma which a Sputnik event would cause to galvanize the country into action. Typically, you'd look at innovation in a country as coming from 3 different kinds of capital: human capital, intellectual capital in the form of ideas, and financial capital. And for reasons that would require a lengthier explanation, I think the U.S. right now is suffering in all of those areas. You know, you look at the public education system. There was recently a study published by Johns Hopkins which termed 10% of American public schools, K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade schools, as dropout factories, where something like 40% plus of the students fail to complete high school. Then, for a variety of reasons, we're seeing shifts in the historic waves of immigration of people who want to buy into the American dream, not only go to a great American university for a PhD, but then settle down in America, buy the house, buy the car, buy into the American dream, as the standard of living worldwide improves and as it becomes a rational decision, if you're from Bangalore or Shanghai, to come to America, get that degree, and then go home. And in fact, American universities, who for financial and other reasons are now globalizing at a ferocious rate, are now making it easy. MIT just announced that it was opening a campus in Singapore. So if you don't want to live in America, you can still get the benefits of a great MIT education. So this notion of educational institutions as global brands is becoming extremely important. And there's much that could be said about shifts in the climate for research. I mean, America still spends about 50% of all the R&D money worldwide, both public and private money, but the way that it's invested is increasingly controversial in the U.S. And of course, we as a society are spending a lot of money on various priorities that add up to trillions of dollars of promissory notes for debt service and for prosecuting a couple of wars and for replacement of aging infrastructure that severely diminish the free cash flow, so to speak, that's available for investing in the new. So I think that's the picture that I see in the world. A lot of countries racing for the high ground. You know, America's showing some erosion in its innovation engine. As a matter of fact, you've heard, no doubt, a lot of calls for an education president or an energy president in the U.S., but I think the discussion is increasingly turning to this notion of an innovation president, because the idea somehow of being able to master the processes for dealing with the kind of wicked problems that afflict society requires innovation. And innovation, as you know, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, begins at the top. If you have a CEO or a president who understands innovation, you'll have the top down as well as the bottom up. If there is a neglect of that issue at the level of leadership, you'll have a stewardship process that is fundamentally incomplete, and that obviously would be a big dilemma. So looking ahead, however, I think we have to challenge ourselves, all of us, in Finland and worldwide, in terms of making our concepts of innovation more sophisticated at the same time as we are seeking for the fruits of innovation. I think that we almost need some kind of a new vocabulary and a new set of concepts. One of the most important questions I think there is the following. If innovation is the answer, what's the question? Think about Finland. If innovation is the big answer for Finland, well, what's the question? What's the purpose of innovation? I've had the opportunity to interview leaders of various countries, and often the answer comes back in a fairly prosaic way. You know, we're prosperous, and we want to stay prosperous. Well, nobody could argue with that, but it's kind of like a hierarchy of needs phenomenon. Once you've satisfied your basic requirements for social stability and prosperity, what else is there? And of course, we've been talking about a lot of the wicked problems that afflict the world and that also call upon each country to show a sense of noble purpose in terms of linking the innovation engine that's local to that country to maybe even a global sense of welfare, a global definition of welfare. I say in my recent book that it used to be that people would say, what's good for America is good for the world. And one of the chapters ends with a plea for a reversal of that logic, so that we start in America thinking that what is good for the world is good for America. So I think innovation is interesting in many respects, but it also is particularly interesting because it offers a double bottom line. You know, I define an innovation nation in my book, not just as a country that's good at innovation, but as a country that's good at innovation to pursue world-changing goals. And that's why the Finnish situation is so exciting, because I think Sitran and the leadership here has the potential to pursue best practices to kind of unravel the onion of innovation further so we can get on with pursuing these world-changing goals.
Thank you, John. Unfortunately, we do not have time to tell you about your role in the presidential election. I understand, or presidential campaigning. I understand that you are advising one candidate. I do not have time to say the name, but she's a female candidate.
I think she's pretty sophisticated about innovation now.
Yeah, that's right. But let's leave China and India for a while. We will return back to the role of these two giants, new giants in the future. But many of you mentioned the role of technology. What kind of role technological revolution is able to play, especially when solving this major problem, major challenge, climate change? My question is, do you agree with Bill Clinton that we have roughly 20 years' time to decide what is our fate here on the earth? And if so, do you believe that it will be possible, if we are taking this positive road, is it possible, Jorma, to do something like with the ICT sector, so that developing countries like India and China are able to take a leapfrog, not to follow our rule?
I think we have a big mountain to climb. So the job ahead of us is a bit similar like what Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome report wrote in 1971, when they described the world that which is going towards destruction. Copper, silver being all depleted, none left in 1990, and a very pessimistic report. What they did not figure out was two things: technological change, which meant that you don't need copper because you had optical fiber and mobile communications, so that China is actually not importing copper too much at all, even if everybody felt that to build a telecommunication network you have to use all the world's copper for that purpose. And that was the reason for the bleak forecast. And also global trade and competition. The market economy means that nothing ever is finished because you have substitution and technology helps there. If you then look at what is now happening in terms of the challenge on the climate change, I think Bill Clinton is more or less right in the sense that in the next 20 years we will have to devise a very different way of creating energy for our economy and a very different way in how we generate growth, because by 2050 we cannot have the kind of CO2 development and what is being forecast with the current technologies. And the technology lead times are so long that we are in a hurry to change the pattern of the forecast. And why am I optimistic? You know, why hasn't this technology evolution or innovation happened before? The reasoning is really as follows. If you look at the market mechanism on how it has guided innovation, R&D expenditure, etc., in the area of energy, it is quite remarkable. Two things have happened. First of all, there's the fossil fuels and the price of fossil fuels. After the second oil crisis in 79-80, it was surprising, actually amazing, how quickly the oil price came down by 82, 83 to $15 or so level, depending on nominal or real price, whichever you look at. It's somewhere there. And it stayed there for almost 20 years, till early part of this decade. And that meant that the fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal, were so significantly cheaper than any other source of energy that it was not economical. The marketplace did not attract innovation, R&D expenditure into alternative technologies. So we had a 20-year gap of very low investment, very low R&D into not only alternative energies, but also in how to make clean coal, how to make engines which run more not only more economically, but also in a clean way. And there was a 20-year gap of extremely low R&D, and that's everybody to blame: the governments, the research institutions, the car manufacturers, the energy companies. We all are to blame, in fact. And it's an amazing period if you look at the statistics. Now it's a very different. In the last 3 or 4 years, you have had an explosion of interest into alternative technologies, into clean coal, into making things happen. And I'm really optimistic that this money will start pay off. The lead times are long, as we know. All I would like to ask is discuss with some TechS people on what the attitudes were to information technology investments in 1980s. I mean, it was amazing how difficult it was to try and say that, yes, this will be a big change. Why don't you support at least by 5% of our R&D from government money? And we have a little bit of that attitude into energy in many quarters.
Thank you, Jorma. John, do you believe that Americans are ready to understand the message of Bill Clinton and ready to take the measures needed? Because if America is involved, something really starts to happen. American resources are urgently needed.
Well, no, I don't think they're ready to accept that right now. I'm not even sure if I agree with Bill Clinton's message, to tell you the truth. I think that this discussion has been very interested in focusing on that if you look back over the history of human innovation, and you look back over the efforts of human beings to plan for whatever the future is going to be, neither have been very well organized or very successful. I mentioned Europe has never had to innovate in peace. I think it's true. It's always been a war which helped you do it.
And then imitate Americans.
Recently, not ours, But Europe was hit by an upheaval which led to all sorts of new progress. Human beings seem not to be able to take the lessons of the future and to deal with them, shall we say, a straight line. They have to always have some strong motivation. And that's why I think all of the discussion about climate change is not only excellent, but is needed, because it's going to probably scare us into doing something. I'm an optimist who believes that the state of technical innovation, the state of technical achievement in human society is really probably only at its very early 25% of its possibility, and that a lot of these things, I agree completely, will be dealt with by new technologies. They will be dealt with by people living differently, just as the Club of Rome told us that by right now we would have wood fires here because there would be no oil left. The fact is that there's more oil available every year. And so I do believe that the way that societies move forward is to see difficult challenges, and in particular to see the prospect of pain. I think you mentioned that. I think unfortunately the prospect of pain is still one of the largest motivating factors. You asked, I think, why is it that Finland and Ireland seem to have similar propensity now for innovation? Well,
we are drinking enough.
Part of it is because, and also, well, I didn't talk about that part, but partially because Finland and Ireland have experienced lots of pain in the past. Mm-hmm. You knew that you had to do something.
Short comment for Jorma.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, we here in Europe tend to think that the Americans, they haven't woken up, their attitudes are all wrong on the climate change, we know how it's going to go. Time to wake up here, because exactly. Today, if you look at the amount of money, R&D money going in the US to alternative technologies, new technology sources, it is 5 times the amount of money that Europe spends on the same matter. Yeah. They have woken up, and they will come big time.
This was an excellent comment. Yeah. And now it's time to move to former European politicians. Why Europeans are so slow? We are in the beginning, we are quite good. We recognize that problem is coming. We have good future planning and so on. But how is it always so that execution is so difficult for us?
Well, there's a lot of questions in that. I mean, to go to the Bill Clinton thing and back into the question you've just asked me, I don't disagree with the notion that there's a sense of urgency and that we need to respond with a sense of urgency. And I have some doubts about putting it in very precise and finite terms. Something happens in 20 years, or we're all dead at some stage, but you know what I mean if I say we're all dead. It's too pessimistic and too precise a view. I think that the answer, and so coming around to the European part as well, I think the answer to the climate change issue will have to be found on a lot of fronts. And there's probably no one big solution, but a whole complex, to use a phrase earlier, matrix of interconnected smaller solutions. Let me give an example, and here, if I take a European example, it's technology-led rather than dirigist and government-led, because I think we need to separate out the several Europes of which we might speak in responding. I was just in the past few weeks, as you know, in Shanghai, and I was at an event which was testing across the globe new technologies in the whole area of mobility, so hybrid technologies, fuel cell technologies, etc. And European companies, just to give an example, on fuel savings on known technology today, but mostly not used, especially in Europe, green tyres with low rolling resistance that can save up to 10% of fuel, not on most of our cars. The technology is there. Stop-start system, so when you're in the city and you stop the car, you're not burning off fuel and you're saving on emissions. It's a simple technology, not only European but also European, not in most European cars. It's there today. New catalytic converters, many of them again developed by European companies that pull out, even at low temperature, lots of the particulate matters that leave our cities dirtier than they need to be. All that is there, but it isn't actually in our products. Now, if you were asking me about connecting that kind of technology to European action, my view there, because I don't like actually too much dirigism, we have to be open to go with certain flows, but there's an area where you could have what I would call smart European regulation. asking the producers in a reasonable time horizon to click in the available technologies that can do those kinds of things. I've given kind of one concrete example because it's not any one measure, but the sum of the things I described, if the sales pitch was correct, and I put in that condition, I'm not an expert, could save, given fuel consumption and emissions in Europe between the two, by factors of up to 40% for any given vehicle and its emissions and so on. I just actually can't get my head around the fact that this technology is there, this urgency is there, and we fail to marry them. Smart regulation to do with promoting technological advantage, not regulation as barrier, regulation as aid, as releasing opportunity. There's some space, I think, where, to go to your question to me, the European governance space can try to seek a reasonable way. And why are we so slow? I think because we have a kind of a sense of in-betweenness. You wrote a very good report on innovation. It was met with a lot of consensus. The good thing with consensus is that no one argued. The bad thing is it's a dead hand. Consensus can be a very dead hand. I think we need more robust statement of diverse opinion in Europe if we're to get away from the dead hand of the excess of excessive consensus. And the one final thing, it's sometimes easier to agree, as we've done during the German presidency recently, on our headline goals as Europe. But our difficulty is that the goals need to be delivered in capital cities. And your question about Europe provokes in my mind, which Europe? Because if we're not pointing some of these indicators the same way, the logic of capital cities connecting to the logic of their leaders when they meet in summits, we begin to get a disconnection which can leave us with the Europe of promising much, delivering much less, and ending up with a big credibility gap. And that partly was the Europe rejected, only partly, in the French referendum.
Thank you. Time is running. We have still how many minutes? 3 minutes only. Oh, so we have to be very short. My last question is, because time is running out, my last question is for all of you, but I will start with John Kao. Is it the 19th century it was British, 20th century it was American. This century, is it going to be American, European? Is it going to be Chinese, Indian, or Chindian, like some people are saying? Short comments of all of you.
I think it's likely to be the century of all of us, if we will let it. I think that what's most interesting is the blending that's coming about as, for instance, entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and China collaborate, as talent flows around the world. You know, I said talent, capital, and ideas were the currencies of innovation. Well, those are really mobile classes of assets, so they go wherever the action is. And so I think that countries that can place a premium not only on education, but on cultural intelligence, that can place a premium on formulating alliances, smart alliances, and that can move towards what I'm beginning to see as a business model for innovation, which is kind of a systems integrator model, where you don't have to own all the resources, but you have to have the smarts to really be able to assemble best practices in low-cost manufacturing areas, or high-quality clinical trials areas, or places where people have specific kinds of expertise to create a fabric of innovation and of enterprise that will create value. Bearing in mind also this notion of, what's good for each of us is good, should be good for all of us.
Thank you. John Kornblum.
Well, I'll just agree. I think it's going to be the blended century, the globally integrated century. I think that the key is, if you have to boil it down to one thing, is the IT revolution. You don't have to be the United States now to be a world leader, as Finland has shown. Look at how the Baltic states are doing. You can import everything on your little home screen. And so I think those people who understand. 5 years ago, Americans and French were fighting about, the French said it's going to be a multipolar world. We said, no, it's going to be a Western world, and American dominated. Now it's not going to be either, but we don't have the vocabulary. The other thing that I think John's other point, which I think we should all focus on, is all of us, none of us, have the vocabulary to deal with this. And starting to learn these new concepts is going to be one of the keys, and I think it'll be a blended century. Whatever we do, those who learn this new vocabulary will be successful.
Thank you, John. And then Jorma.
We have created this concept, blended century, difficult to start arguing. Just an additional comment. I think the role of Asia is bound to increase. That of America will, in all likelihood, will not increase. Europe will have a real hard time, a challenge to make sure its role will be what it is. And I would really wonder whether this, in its small, interesting way, could be a century of Africa, that Africa would find its identity and be an interesting continent. Yes, it's only 800 million people, somebody would say, and all sorts of problems, challenges, but it could be in an interesting way a century when Africa finds again its identity. I say no more on that, but an interesting one.
Yeah, and then Pat Cox, your view on
well, I buy into, in so far as I understand it, the terms that have been used. Unipolarity is out the door. Multipolarity, in its 20th century sense, is out the door. It's some kind of mutual codependency. My final, it's a micro comment rather than a macro one on this. My main reason to go to China a few weeks ago was to bring some Irish business leaders with me, to recognise that there's changes there, and to say we can build opportunity by building where the opportunity will be, new relationships with ourselves. Don't be afraid of the future. Go out and embrace it. Don't prevent it by staying away from it. Engage with it and win with it by embracing it. I think that has to be the message for an intelligent Europe, an intelligent Finland, and for people who can try to reshape, as you wish to do, the debate for the 21st century.
I have no opportunity to make any major conclusions now, but this discussion reminds me one saying coming from the United States. One American had said that it's not enough that we are doing things better. We have to be able to do better things. And I think this is the right conclusion when listening to you. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that time is so short, but I think we have been able to have enjoyable discussion, or have we? Thank you.